All right. So, welcome to the modern job hunt. So, are you wondering how BC's transparency legislation, which has come into effect recently, impacts you or your job search? So, I am testing Instagram Live, so I just got some feedback. So, for those of you that are listening in, that's hopefully it's still working. So, are you wondering how BC's recent pay transparency legislation impacts your job hunt or your existing employment? Stay tuned for my discussion with James, an employment lawyer, as we deep dive into pay transparency. So, this is the Modern Job Hunt. It's a podcast about finding work and the employment sector in general from the perspective of someone impacted by a layoff in the tech sector. So, it's really first person kind of content. So today we have James with us. James is an employment lawyer with PortaLaw. So James, he is a employment and human rights lawyer at PortaLaw with a commitment to being helpful, honest, and human. James brings a wealth of experience from large law firms and in-house counsel roles to offer practical, client-focused legal solutions. A cheerful and dedicated graduate of the University of British Columbia, and he's ready to address your workplace needs with a uniquely personal approach. Welcome, James. So, with that said, anyone can comment, provide questions to James or myself as we dive into the Pay Transparency Act. So, a lot of this episode will focus to our viewers in British Columbia, Canada, where this act is relevant. We will reference some other transparency legislation that has taken place across North America. But with that said, I'll pass it over to James. We'll just go into kind of a Pay Transparency Act 101. So over to you, James. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Oh, no. Well, you probably saw my mouth moving, and what I was saying was, thank you so much for having me here. Very excited that this is going to be a lot of fun. Kind of as the countdown started happening, I said, "Oh, this is, we're doing it live, and normally I get a chance to do a couple recordings or presentations, so I appreciate you bearing with me as we move through this." Um, as all lawyers do, I'll probably give a bit of a disclaimer just at the very beginning for all the viewers and the listeners. Happy to field questions. Um, as a BC lawyer, my expertise is BC law. I have some experience working with clients who have employees across the country, but I am a BC lawyer. The other thing is that I won't be able to give specific legal advice. So if you have a very particular and specific question that's clearly about you, even if you say, hypothetically, I have my friend has this question, and then this very detailed scenario is happening. I'm not able to specifically answer that. Happy to connect separately, and I think Ryan, you'll share my details on that. But to the extent questions are more general, or if you ask a specific question, and I'll do my best to answer it somewhat in a general sense. I think folks find that helpful. So, given that very long introduction, again, my name is James. I work at PortaLaw. We're a small law firm here in Vancouver, and we focus on employment and human rights. Um, and a big thing that's come out that is really at an intersection of employment and human rights is the Pay Transparency Act. And so everyone probably on some level has seen some buzz about this. The act did come into effect in May, and then there were certain sections that have come into force later. And so really there are three main components of the Pay Transparency Act. The first is that it talks about rules regarding pay history and pay secrecy. So essentially, and I'll get into each of these sections in a bit more detail, but at a high level, employers in BC are prohibited from asking job candidates or their employees, what they were paid in former positions, and can't stop or punish or retaliate against employees from asking about their pay or discussing their pay with their coworkers. So that's number one. Number two, employers now have to include wage and salary information in their public job postings. And we can talk about in a second about the distinction of what is a public job posting. But as of November, um, this is the case, and additional guide. The government's recently released some additional guidance on what that actually looks like, and as we'll talk about in a second, it's actually quite broad. And then the third is that pay transparency reports will be required to show a breakdown of pay based on gender, and it's kind of a rolling. There's a bit of a rolling requirement here in the sense that the government's starting with the largest employers and moving to smaller employers over the next couple of years. And I finished with this as kind of the third central component, but really it highlights the main crux of this legislation, that it's an effort to help reduce the gender pay gap. And so it's not the only thing that the government is doing, but it's one of many things the government is trying to do to identify and tackle the challenge of disparity in between pay amongst genders. And so importantly, um, I think this concept of pay equity is really important to just outline up front. And the idea is that, if you have two folks that are working the same job and they're not being paid the same, that's one aspect of it. But what pay equity on a more macro scale, especially with genders, is looking at is, if there's roles that are particularly gendered that are making much more than other roles that are different roles, but both are contributing to the company in the same way, then those jobs should reflect uh, a bit more equity in terms of the pay, and that's part of what the government's trying to do here. And so, as we talk about perhaps maybe some of the limits and challenges in this legislation, I think it's important to set the stage in terms of the context of where it's coming from. So I'll pause for now before diving into all the details, 'cause I know, Ryan, you've read a whole lot of stuff about this and are very up to speed. And maybe if there's anything you want to add, I'll give you an opportunity before I'll get into a bit more detail about the three different components.
Yeah, I think let's jump into component one because I when I read the legislation, I viewed a component one, which is, if you share your kind of salary information with colleagues, you can't have negative things occur to you. Was my interpretation of it. I thought that this was already in place. So, like, as a non-lawyer, I just thought, oh, you can already do that. We're a fairly progressive province. Like, would my employer really come after me for talking about salaries? And so, as an employee, I've used this as like dotting the I's and crossing the T's on a holistic legislation. But maybe as an employment lawyer, your view is like, no, this happens. People do have issues where their employer dismisses them because of things. So is this kind of like bringing the employment laws up to modern standards of kind of like norms, or is this actually like very good for employees?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The I think there's a really a mixed bag of employers in BC. And as a somewhat value forward, values driven firm, we're somewhat self selecting in a lot of the clients that we have. And so, for a lot of the clients that we work with, concepts around transparency and equity are already at the forefront of what they're trying to do. Um, but we represent both businesses and workers. And so on the worker side, we definitely see it a lot more. And it's not uncommon to have clauses in an employment contract that actually restrict and prohibit an employee from talking about their compensation with other employees. And you can appreciate that the benefit to the employer is that when employees get together and talk about what they're making, and they find out that, you know, Fred or Martha, a couple desks down, is making a lot more than them, then they're unhappy about it. And so generally, secret employers have used secrecy or restrictions around talking about what employees actually make, and preventing that to, I guess, pay employees less is the idea.
Okay, so that kind of covers number one. In general, it is a benefit, but it's probably not the most important part of the legislation, which was why I wanted to kind of touch on it lightly. But then the real kind of core benefit, I think, is the second piece there about clearly outlining in the job description. And so you mentioned publicly listed. Now, I'm not sure exactly what publicly listed means and what jobs should listed, and what do we do as an employee when you go into an interview and there's no information in the job description and it's been posted after. November 1st? Like what kind of teeth may exist in the legislation?
Yeah, great question. And I'll just jump back quickly to step to the pay history piece, because I do think that that actually comes up quite a bit in interviewing and hiring, and employers will ask, or at least anecdotally I hear in negotiations, employer asks, well, what were you making before? And they'll use that as the metric before to set a new wage. And often employees change jobs because they're unhappy with a number of things, including their compensation. And so the idea is that, well, that shouldn't be the metric or the kind of the anchor of the negotiation of what I should be paid moving forward. And so by asking about pay history, I think employers, whether intentionally or unintentionally, essentially feed into this cycle of keeping people around whatever they're making to make, and so any increases would be incremental increases. And so I do think that component may actually have a bigger impact on people being paid more in new jobs than actually the job postings, posting salary ranges and job postings. But that is entirely conjecture and kind of my armchair opinion on that one. But you asked
And
a really good
I know
question.
that that we were chatting earlier about when they ask you your desired wage, and I think that unfortunately the reality is most people price anchor on their last wage. So if you made like 100,000, you may say I want to make 110 or 115, not knowing that the company is willing to offer 130 in prior times. At least now it's far more clear when they list the pay band that it's like, oh, it's 130 to 150. Well, you should never say 115 in that case because you're below the band. So
Mm.
at least that's kind of a real benefit of the kind of new legislation, and I see that as quite beneficial for matching and alignment between kind of the company and the individual.
Definitely, I agree with that 100%. Um, you had asked a good question about, what is kind of a public listing and what do you actually have to put in there? Well, I think you asked the first question, and I'll speak to the second as well. And so I think broadly taken, it's anything that you're putting out to the public, which includes anything posted on by third parties on, websites, job boards, whether it's LinkedIn, um, ZipRecruiter, wherever else people are searching for jobs. The government did provide some guidance that they call help wanted posters that don't advertise a specific opportunity, or general recruitment campaigns that don't mention specific jobs are not captured by this requirement. And then if you're posting something internally as an employer, you also don't have to um, comply with that requirement. And so really it's anything that you're putting out into the world that anyone else could find, that specifically relates to an actual job that you're looking to hire for. Um, a- a- and I guess, as BC law, it relates to what's captured under there is anything that someone in BC um, could apply for and work for. And so that's, I think, that extra criteria that's important. Um, it's interesting that you only have to put salary, and you can put a range. And so you can't just put, some sort of number and upwards. You do have to put a range. Currently, there's no restriction on how big that range can be. And so I think that's where employers may still give really wide ranges. Um, and sometimes it may be because they're searching for applicants and they want to cast a wide net and they want to be open to, whoever they might hire. Importantly, an employer isn't necessarily required to you know, be limited to whatever that range is. But in the job market, they'll probably put quite a range, and you see this, I think, at least in government postings already, where they'll put a range and then they'll provide some guidance that, you know, except in really rare situations, you'll probably at least get the medium or on the lower half. Um, as far as teeth, that was the other question that you asked. Right now, there's not a lot of teeth in the legislation. Um, I was digging around and seeing what I could find in terms of actually, how to enforce this type of stuff. the act does create a new role of director of pay transparency, and so presumably that's the person that you're going to go to if an employer is not complying with the act. At least right now, the messaging from the government is um, they're really working. I think some language I've seen in some news reports has been an educational approach with non-compliant employers, and they'll send a letter, they'll work with employers, but it's really encouraging voluntary participation. Um, in terms of complying specifically with, I guess, posting salary ranges. Um, Separate to that is, of course, if you do find out you are being treated in a way that isn't equal, and that treatment is based on your gender, for example, or your sex or your sexual orientation, human rights law still protects employees. And so, under the BC Human Rights Code, um, there are a number of protected grounds or characteristics, and they include some of those things that I just said, and other things that you may think. Someone's age, indigenous identity, physical disability, mental disability, which are somewhat kind of rude but broad phrases to describe anything of a semi-permanent nature, or a condition that you have. And if you're mistreated because of those in employment, including in the hiring process, you actually, and there isn't a what's called a bona fide occupation requirement, or a legitimate reason why an employer needs to just treat different classes of employees or applicants differently, and the bar is very high for that, then you still have then you would be discriminated against if you're mistreated. And so backstopping all of this is, well, there may not be a lot of teeth right now in terms of kind of salary ranges and postings. If you actually are mistreated, um, then human rights law still protects you.
Gotcha. One of the things from your statement there that kind of was interesting was early on you mentioned internal postings do not apply. So for people in jobs right now, we'll get into it in more detail later. But so your internal posting doesn't apply, and your employer already knows your salary history. Is this kind of like a difficult position for those employees? Because it's like I found every single time I've got a new job, they've anchored off the last job and said, oh, you get 10%, even though it doesn't have anything to do with where I sit in the next band, the skills that I'm coming into. It's often that anchoring. It's you're also not finding out the band by apparently, which is my experience in other employers. They don't often just have an internal system that shows you the band. You do have to go to sites like Levels and Glassdoor and others. So is this legislation largely kind of keeping that use case and putting it aside for now?
Yeah, good question. I think that the hope is that the other components of the act somewhat mitigate that impact. And so, because you're allowed to talk to your employees, the other employees and your coworkers about what they're making, at least theoretically, you should be able to figure out what other people in that next band, if it's a manager level or a director level, are making. Um, and you shouldn't be able to be kind of punished for it. You can also can't be punished for asking for, what the salary should be. And so I think on some level, the act is trying to create a safer space within workplaces to actually just have these conversations and promote and be I guess a bit of a mover or a culture shift within workplaces. And then in addition, that third component of the Pay Transparency Act in terms of pay transparency reports, I think as those get rolled out and more employers actually have to prepare those, then it's not going to be necessarily specific per job. Maybe able to see exactly what everybody makes, but employers will have an obligation to essentially set up their own quartiles or bands, and based on kind of gender and role, see who's making what in those um, in those different quartiles. And I think interestingly, the pay transparency reports require more disclosure than the salary bands, and so they're going to require disclosure of both overtime and bonuses. So often in the discrepancy in pay is not just salary, it's often all the extras that you're getting. Yeah, and so that I
Yeah.
think that was a long answer to say I think that it's a person who is applying internally to a role and not entirely sure what that next level of compensation or that salary is going to be, maybe isn't the kind of top priority of the legislation right now, and going back to its main purpose in terms of a more macro shift in terms of the gender pay gap. I think those folks will be brought along for the ride, especially if there's a gender component, again, with the human rights aspect still providing some protection in there, but not necessarily, I think, um, at the forefront of the legislation.
Yeah, and I would like to kind of highlight to anyone listening in that legal changes and cultural changes are not the same. So, as someone that has done internal discussions inside companies before, I'm a firm believer in pay transparency and pay equity. And it does not mean that your management or directors will appreciate those internal conversations, especially when that information is brought up in salary reviews and other things like that. So, you may be protected, but it doesn't always mean that everyone's going to be super supportive of paid transparency. And I think that's something that people have to keep in mind, that just because you are now protected from a legal standpoint, it does not mean that everyone's going to suddenly embrace this concept. And that's something you should think about when you're doing conversations with colleagues and bringing up data points, and kind of going back right to the start. If you're wondering, is this really a big deal? Basically, in my research, I found that BC has one of the highest gender pay gaps in Canada, with women earning almost 17%, so 16.7% less than men on average in 2021. So if you're wondering, yeah, it's a pretty considerable deal, this legislation, and hopefully we will work to close that gap. And I think that the one surprising thing that kind of came out of all this from my research was that research in other areas was that 2% less overall pay to employees was the net result of pay transparency. So 10 states have already implemented this. Other countries have implemented more structured pay transparency earlier. And so that 2% was a real surprise to me, that despite the fact that we're all learning more, it depresses wages on aggregate. And this, The Economist and others have published articles on this. So um, that was surprising. Now, the good news is that not everyone is impacted evenly. I am a hetero white male, and typically, if you look at the data, my persona tends to benefit because we push harder in negotiations. Nobody knows our salaries, so they kind of are above. And then BIPOC women, others tend to be the ones that are lower. So what this pay transparency does, it kind of brings up certain parties, pushes down certain parties, and it actually pushes down overall wages 2%, which is super interesting. And so I think out of all of kind of the stuff that's going on, James, I'm curious if you're seeing any precedents start to take place, because I know law kind of, you implement law and then people challenge law, and so we're only about 45 days in here. How do you, as a lawyer, follow this stuff and like see what's going on, and do you see cases coming up, and how do you learn about where the law is going?
Really good question. And first, I appreciate you kind of highlighting the significance of what the larger problem that the Pay Transparency Act is trying to address. I think that um, that's super important to mention. As far as where this is going, um, you know, I haven't seen that much that there's the chatter, and employers, are asking about how to comply and what they should be doing. Um, but there hasn't been too much, I think, in terms of conflicts or issues arising, that I've encountered in my own practice. Um, I think there's always a bit of a grace period as folks realize what they should be doing, as employees that start to understand their rights, and once that grows, then I think things often boil to a bit of a that's when issues arise, and I think that's why the government on some level has taken its time pushing out guidance. And so in turn, employers have said, okay, well, you know, how can we be doing what we're supposed to be doing until we know what we're supposed to be doing? And then once they get that guidance, often there's feedback that happens on the back end. And we've seen many, many times, and COVID was a perfect example of this, where the government would come out with regulations or rules, and then the business sector would give feedback, and then the government would come back with a version 2 or a version 3. And so I think it will be a bit of an iterative process. I think right now, um, there are a lot of employers who are already doing this, and the ones who aren't, I think that it's going to take some time before people push back, and actually force them to do that. I think that distinction that you made between kind of legal, what's the law, and what's the culture, it's going to need a bit more oomph, I think, to get certain workplaces that maybe where this isn't the culture before people start challenging it and making some noise.
And I think it's very interesting to see this legislation, whether it is prompting a more pay and gender equity transformation in the overall landscape or not. I'm seeing companies like Jane out of North Vancouver. They do kind of clinic software, and they actually were releasing video saying how they set their band range, like how they benchmark on the market, how they evaluate quartiles, and a bunch of stuff like that. They had that linked off one of their job postings. So it's like, wow, that's like way ahead of the legislation to say like not only this is what we're paying for this role, but this is how we benchmark you on the way, which I think that'll need to become the norm because like when you show your pay band and someone's in the 25th percentile, it's like, why did you put me there? That's going to be the instant conversation that occurs. So I think it will push people towards where Jane kind of is extremely transparent about how they benchmark. And I understand that some companies won't be ready for these conversations, which is why they may not be listing things until they kind of get tapped on the shoulder.
For sure. And I do think, and I think Jane's a great example, that certain companies will take this and use this as a competitive advantage, in terms of the hire in terms of hiring. What sets us apart. um, I imagine, for a number of smaller businesses, the fact that they're not able to offer competitive salaries with perhaps some bigger businesses is something that seems scary. And I think what at least I'm seeing in my practice and the companies that I work with is that, you know, they've taken that as a bit of a challenge and asked themselves, I think in a meaningful way, "Well, what are the benefits of working here? And what can we offer? And can we really reduce someone's compensation to their salary, or is there a much larger package? And if there is, are we doing a good job of marketing that in our job descriptions or in our recruitment?" And so I think it's forcing, I think one thing that maybe is a benefit is that it's forcing employers to be more creative about, um, what they're offering employees, if they are offering employees lots of great things, to do a better job at communicating that.
Yeah, well said. I'm still. I mean, we're only a couple months in here, but I'm surprised as someone doing interviews when they explain, oh, we have 4% RSP matching and 10% bonus and all this kind of stuff, and it's like their job description is extremely generic around all those
Mhm.
things, and I'm like, so you're giving me stuff, but you're not explaining it. It's like it doesn't make any sense as someone. It's like, why would you pay someone more and not explain that in the posting? Because then you'll attract higher quality candidates. So I think even the employers themselves are going to gradually learn that if they're losing out on candidates because of pay, they need to be more transparent up front about what they pay.
Exactly. And I think that something that's perhaps hopefully again will be beneficial is that this Pay Transparency Act, and I've talked about other jurisdictions, really isn't coming out of nowhere, and it's not about reinventing the wheel. The federal government rolled out, a Pay Equity Act, and I think maybe it was 2018. I think it maybe came into force a couple years later. And so the federal government for federally regulated employees, has a model of this. A lot of public sector jobs have pay bands already. Their job postings often look very different than the private sector where they talk about, pension, benefits, vacation, all of these things. And so the templates are out there. And it'll be interesting to see how the private sector now, because it's starting to have to do this, jumps onto this and what parts of um, other existing regimes that they pull from or examples they pull from.
And kind of jumping into, I'll just put a prompt up for like existing employees. I know we touched on this lightly, but like what happens in the event that a job posting goes live and it's showing 130 to 150 and you're already in that role? Is there a legal employment right to be in that band, or is it kind of like that is up to that employer and individual to resolve it themselves? Like what is legal and what is practice? Is there a line there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's actually an interesting scenario that I'm seeing come up in my practice, where when you have I think what I hear you saying is you have existing employees in a certain range. They see the company is now hiring for someone new in that role, and they're saying, "Well, we're going to pay this new person much more than what we're going to pay you, that we're currently paying you," and so there is no legal obligation, at least right now, for an employer to, unless they say, they have a policy and as part of their employment contract or their terms, they say you will always be in this band, um, to actually increase the salary of their existing employees if they're bringing someone else new in. Practically speaking, I think employees are using that to leverage and negotiate for more. And there's at least one client that we've worked with that has taken the approach that every time someone comes in, then they recalibrate and they lift everybody else up. There's other employers that have taken the approach, well, you know, that's- each hire is a little specific and dependent on the market and dependent on our business, and everybody brings different skills in. And so even if you're kind of in the same role, um, you know, the reason we're bringing this other person in is because we don't have the skills internally or the right candidate internally to step into this role. At least that's what's said on paper. I mean, there's lots of different reasons that happen for hiring, and there's a lot of politicking. And so, short answer, those employees don't have a legal right to have their pay increased, but practically, I think it provides them with a lot more leverage and may encourage employers to look internally first before looking externally, to make that next hire, knowing that it may sow some discontent internally if you're bringing in someone new and everybody knows what that new person is making.
Yeah, and if everyone's wondering, so where did that 2% come from, that net decrease? Well, on the flip side, if you're making 160 and the role's being posted at 130 to 150, you understand that you're now above the band for that role. And so from all of my reading, the upper outliers basically will probably see their pay stall, or not grow as much as they kind of bring the lower individuals closer into the band or up the band. And that's largely how that 2% occurs, because if everyone knows where the band is, where's the median, all that kind of stuff, then it's far easier for the company to push harder in negotiations and prevent that band from just sliding loosely upwards. So that's why you do see that is there's less outliers. There's kind of more incentive for the organization to push hard back, which is the minor unfortunate side of the legislation. But I think as an aggregate, I think also 2% overall, maybe 10% for some upper outliers. I think there's a lot of benefits to knowing that your employer will be have a more cohesive environment. Like I have always found it challenging when I know my employees, fellow employees are getting paid 10, 20K less than me, or 10K more than me. It's like, okay, we're all going to be a little bit more cohesive now. I think that might be the benefit that comes out of this, despite potentially slightly lower wages.
I think so. I mean, that's definitely the intent. And again, I think having different business units who maybe, you know, there's a discrepancy in their pay, but contribute in arguably very equal ways, leveling out the pay between them, which often has a gendered component to it.
And as a BC lawyer in the region of BC, this is where the legislation applies. Now, a role that may be posted as Canada dash remote. My interpretation is that as a BC individual, I should have the right to see the pay band, which is how I believe it is written. Do you view this as like not real from a legal perspective that like a Toronto-based firm that has a remote posting for Canada will like actually implement that, or how do you view that? Because like I see a lot of BC-based offices listing and putting pay bands, but not so much national postings yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. I agree with your assessment there that it should have that pay band, and an employee should be able to ask those questions. And so for employers that are looking to hire or have employees in multiple different provinces, the task or challenge that they face is complying with local laws in all of those different jurisdictions. And so, something that I work with a number of clients when they have employees in different provinces, is that there are different rules that they have to follow. And so, it very much isn't a new concept that an employer who is looking to hire in different places has to follow different rules that are often similar but not necessarily identical, in those provinces, both in the hiring process and in the when they actually are employing folks who are working remotely from those provinces.
And so if your contract was written from a Toronto-based firm with the Toronto office and all that kind of stuff, which legal precedent do you follow? This is kind of an employee question. Do you sign a contract that says you're following the Ontario rules, or do you always follow the residence and address that you put on your contract? Is that like how do the rules apply? This is something that I don't know, and we're just kind of freestyling here.
Yeah, no, it's that's a really good question, and so kind of the legal terms that they use to describe it is kind of like choice of law and forum, and then so what law applies, and then where do you have to go to fight about things. And so, as a general rule, and this is not always the case, but in most cases, the law that applies um, to an employee is usually where the employee is living and working, especially if it's clear that they're under a remote arrangement. And so, uh, there are some really important implications of this. There are certain pieces of legislation that protect employees in different provinces. In BC, we have the Employment Standards Act. There's a variation of that in every province. In Alberta, it's the Employment Standards Code. In Ontario, they call it the Employment Standards Act 2000. I guess that's when it came out, and they wanted to put a date on it, even though it's now almost 2024. And the rules in those provinces are slightly different. Um, and so, if you are, for example, a BC employer and you have an employee who's working remotely from Toronto, and you have them on a BC employment agreement, and it says, for example, all you get on termination is what's given to you under the Employment Standards Act in BC, that actually isn't enough. And because under the Ontario Employment Standards Act, you get a bit more. You get a couple other things on termination that you don't get in BC. For example, you get benefit continuation. There's a concept of severance that's different than termination pay, and so in that case, that clause is actually unenforceable, and an employee is entitled to a whole other separate bucket of rights on termination. And when you hear about employees getting months and months of severance, um, is because employees generally have these two buckets of rights, one from the Employment Standards Act and the other from something called common law. And what common law is kind of a set of laws that come from our court system, and we've inherited it uh, from England, where with much of our legal system. And the idea is that judges, well, they say they don't make law, but they apply it. But they make law, and people get upset. They go to court. They have a trial, a judge makes a decision, that decision becomes a case. You may have heard of the phrase case law or precedent. And so then future judges are bound by the decision of previous judges. And over time, you develop a body of law that slowly changes on the facts and adjusts over time because the facts in the 1800s are different than now. And so that's one of our main sources of law here in Canada. And judges have a law about dealing with employment law, including with severance, and they measure it on a couple of factors, but the key point is that they measure it in months and not weeks. And if an employer and an employee don't limit an employee's entitlement to this common law severance regime um, properly, and the law says, employer, you have all the power, you're the one who drafts the contract. If you don't do it perfect, we're going to throw it out. Then the employee gets entitled to this much larger bucket of rights. And so that was a very long-winded example of why choice of law matters, and that employers working with employees in different provinces really need to be conscious about which laws apply. There's other things, for example, like return statutory leaves like maternity leave and paternity leave differ amongst provinces, or parental leave, I should say, differ amongst provinces, and a couple of other things. So, very, very long answer to the law that usually applies is where the employee is working and living.
And I mean, I'm sure a few folks listening are going, "Hey, this is a job hunting show. What are you doing
Mm,
talking about severance and termination terms and all that?" But this is something that I feel is super critical as someone that was impacted by a round of layoffs. I'll do a mini anecdote to kind of like lead into this, but I had pretty much never had a legal person review a contract. Never really understood the terms of my contracts, whether it had common law applicability or anything like that. And I've worked in tech for over a decade. Have been part of restructurings a couple times, unfortunately. This is the first time where I really dug in. I contacted some friends. They put me in touch with a lawyer. That lawyer, after having a chat when we were talking about this episode, put me in touch with James, and really I knew nothing about my own employment contract, like all of the risks. Like, it's interesting in tech, you work with lawyers all the time in in-house counsel, but you never think about your contract and its ramifications and the risks involved with that. So I wanted to make sure we do touch on negotiation, terms of severance, and kind of how you should evaluate a contract. Because I think generally, when you do get an offer, you're so excited that you just are ready to sign it instantly. But in reality, unfortunately, I think many of us are waking up in the tech sector and saying, if I'm getting laid off every 24 months, like, I got to know what my terms are around my severance, because that is a core part. That's just as relevant as like 10 or 20% more pay if you're getting laid off every 2 years, is understanding how your severance is kind of structured, which is unfortunate. But like, I think so I'll okay, it won't be an actual example, James, because I know you can't comment on that. But when someone receives an offer, what are the steps that they should do from a lawyer's perspective? Like if I were to receive an offer, um, and go to you, can we talk about severance? Can we talk about just like what how do you work with clients? Can you kind of comment on that piece?
Yeah, happy to, and I agree. Of course, I say I agree. This is what keeps me in business, but it tied all to pay transparency, and we talked about how it only talks about salary. Um, there's an interesting organization. These two women do really great work, and they're called the Thoughtful Co. And they work with women to negotiate contracts, specifically. And what they have found in their kind of research and in their work is that when you get to higher levels, the kind of that director level and up, the discrepancy in compensation really isn't about salary, and it's about all the other stuff. And so it's about understanding equity compensation. It's about understanding kind of vacation benefits, other types of benefits, um, allowances, perks, all of those things. And to add to that, and they talk about this as well, is that your termination entitlements are something that you very much need to be thinking about when you're negotiating your contract up front. And so if someone was coming to me and they were offered a job, what we would do is we just work through the offer and say, well, what are your expectations? Um, what's missing? What are the things that maybe you haven't thought to ask in terms of kind of comp and other kind of larger benefits? And the important thing to remember is that the employment contract itself, this is the deal. These are the terms of employment. Often an employee will say, oh, I just want to sign this now and we can talk about all of this stuff later. And you can, but the employer doesn't have any obligation to change the terms of your employment later on. And it's also really hard for their employer to change the terms of your employment once they're set. An employer can't just unilaterally change your employment terms. And so, if you, as an employee, you want certainty up front. And like any good I think this is, maybe perhaps relationship advice in general. It also helps, I think, avoid conflict down the road. If both parties are very clear in terms of their expectations, what is this, what are the terms of this engagement? What's it going to, you know, you know, remove the uncertainty to the extent that you can, then it allows the parties to move forward without having conflicts arise later. From a severance perspective, as mentioned, um, you have these different buckets of rights. And it's important to understand that if you're only being provided the employment standards minimums in BC, what that means is from zero to, for the first 3 months, they can terminate you without notice whatsoever. After that, for no reason, doesn't matter. It's like a probationary period. After that, an employer can terminate an employee without cause. That means for any reason whatsoever, provided it's not otherwise illegal, for example, discriminatory, um, by giving them just a really small number of weeks. So if after 3 months, it's 1 week. After 1 year, it's 2 weeks. And after kind of 3 years, it's 1 week per completed year to a maximum of 8 weeks. If you've been there for if you've been there for more than 3 weeks, over 3 years, you get 3 weeks. If you've been there for over 5 years, you get 5 weeks. If you've been there for over 8 years, you get 8 weeks. If you've been there for 15 years, it still caps out at 8 weeks. That's the minimum that an employer has to provide you. But the important word is that it's a minimum. You can agree by contract to ask for something more. Or if you don't have a contract at all, you're actually entitled to something more. Um, and practically speaking, and you can speak to this a lot better than I can, Ryan, it takes a lot more than a week or 2 weeks to find a new job and to get your affairs in order. And from a parity perspective, often we see employers are asking, well, you need to give us at least 4 weeks or 5 weeks when you resign so we can get our affairs in order. It's going to be a huge impact on the business. But in response, what they're saying is, oh, well, for the first 3 months, we can actually just terminate you and give you nothing with no notice immediately. And so I definitely recommend to anyone who is negotiating the terms of their employment to think about the termination clause up front and advocate for something greater than the Employment Standards Act minimums. Often it can be a sliding scale. For example, you start at a base of 2 to 3 weeks and you get an additional week per completed year. So it grows with service, so it mimics, that length of service recognition that you have under the Employment Standards Act. But just starting off with the bare minimums really puts you in a very difficult position. Practically speaking, I think this also speaks to some of the questions that you asked about existing employees and what protections that they have within a workplace. And so when I work with employers and they're dealing with employees, not the only factor, but an important consideration for dealing with an employee, especially one who maybe you want to get rid of, is what do we have to provide them if we do terminate them? And employees that have long, okay, well, we'd have to give this person at least a couple months. Okay, maybe that's going to change how we approach how we engage with this employee. If I know instead of, for example, knowing that we can get rid of that employee without paying them anything and to just send them on their way, or you only have to give them a week or 2 weeks. And so I think that not just at the end of the employment relationship, but actually during the employment relationship as well, it provides that employee with a bit of protection and leverage and ability to um, have a bit more security, I think, within their employment. So I think that was more of a soapbox pitch for negotiating terms of employment rather than how I go about it. But I think that practically how you go about it is often you'll mark up the contract. You'll look at it and say, look, these are the I've read this, I can accept most of it. These are the things that I want to change, and often just emailing back to your employer, saying, can you change X, Y, and Z? I think you'd be surprised how often employees um, get what they ask for. I think from the employer perspective, often employers uh, will have some sort of standard contract because it's easier that way and it's more efficient, but aren't necessarily opposed to making adjustments to those contracts when somebody asks.
And to kind of go back to your overlapping common law BC Standards Act, I believe was the term you used. Knowing what's in your bucket is something I will always do from now on because I think I always just kind of assumed that you had the common law was universally applicable until a lawyer read my contract and said, no, common law is not applicable to this contract. And so I think for everyone out there, whether you're laid off and looking for your next role to getting an understanding of what's in your next contract, or even if you're an existing employee in the tech sector, I know I am going to get my future contract reviewed probably by James, and make sure I know that, because I know I'll sleep a lot better working in the tech sector, understanding my contract, my severance, my terms, all that kind of stuff. It's unfortunate that that is the world that we live in today, that don't accept a job offer until you have a lawyer review your contract. But I think you understand your risks, and kind of, I think the tech sector is going through a rebalancing at the moment, and I think that like as we're going through this, people need to understand their own risk profile when entering employment. So I think that that's kind of my advice for everyone from a personal perspective, is like, I think that knowing your contract is extremely critical. And I'm just over 5 months into my job search, and so the cost of a lawyer, I don't know what it is for one of these processes, but it's minimal compared to the time and effort it takes to find a job in a down sector. So I think it's a good investment in your career to understand your risk.
I think so. I appreciate that kind of vote of confidence in what we do here, but I generally do believe it. I think it's the important thing to note is that it's becoming a lot more normalized as well. I think given the number of layoffs that have happened over the past year, people have become, as you have, intimately familiar with what happens when they are dismissed from their employment and from their job. And as part of figuring that out, um, they now look ahead in terms of, okay, well, what protections do I want to have moving forward? And so I think sometimes there's a bit of a fear, and I definitely have this conversation with employee clients who are negotiating, a new contract of, should I push back? What is this going to make me look like? And well, I can't speak for every employer. Um, the ones, I think I can say, at least anecdotally, that most businesses now are becoming much more comfortable and accepting of employees that push back on all sorts of terms, just given the sheer number of employees that are doing it.
And I'm curious on, like, knowing confidential information. When you get to the very end, you have an offer on the table. I had another guest come on saying he was a firm believer in either NDAs or MNDAs with the company non-disclosure agreements, so that you could actually gather information like, what's your revenue? How much money do you actually have? How many months of runway? Because I think, like, in the current market, when venture capital funds are shutting down and other things like that, it's like accepting terms to a great contract doesn't necessarily mean there's enough money to fulfill that contract at the end of the day. So can you comment on, like, how someone can protect themselves by gathering more information before signing on the dotted line?
That that's a really good question. I think I've probably seen that limited to uh, employees, or I guess potential employees, who are going to take on a really key role within the organization, and especially if their compensation is tied to company performance in a way beyond just their salary. And so if their bonuses or equity compensation is tied to how the company's doing, of course you have a very and soon to be literal vested interest in how the company's performance, and you want some transparency. I think apart from that, there is there's nothing wrong with asking. Um, I don't advise employees to offer to sign non-disclosure agreements um, upfront. I mean, if that's something that the company wants you to sign, I think you have to ask yourself a couple of questions of what are they trying to keep secret and why? And what am I giving up here in terms of my rights before I even know what I know? And so I think anybody should always be cautious before signing away rights to say or do something. Um, I think they're all good questions to ask, though, and if you end up in that situation, and that's really going to be, you know, what pushes the button into or the ticker to get you that information, then it may be appropriate. I think we're starting to see more transparency, going back to a cultural transparency. If the company is not willing or able to talk to you about their performance and provide you numbers, I think that maybe also gives you pause for question. Obviously, it's easy to say sitting here, and it's a lot harder when you're searching for a job and you have to take a bit more risk. Um, but if you do have the luxury of choice, I think how companies respond to those questions may be indicative of that culture that we talked about before in terms of transparency generally within the organization.
Fantastic. So we're going to kind of wrap it up now. What I like to ask individuals right at the end is kind of their parting tips and tricks for individuals either looking for work or active in the employment market right now. Around, I could either be around employment law in general or around pay transparency. And then any resources. I know you already mentioned, I think another, this the Thoughtful Co. I think it was earlier in the episode. So if you have any other tips like that for people to look up, either books, articles, or kind of organizations that help in this space.
Yeah, I think that the first one, I'd probably be remiss if I didn't plug ourselves. So PortaLaw is both a benefit company and a B Corp. And one of the things that we try to do in terms of our, I guess, positive contributions is organizing and providing kind of clear legal information for folks. So there's a lot of stuff out there. It's tough to keep track of, um, you know, who's saying what, and sometimes there's contradictory things. And so um, our law firm name is Porta Law, and we have a certain section of our website called Open Porta, and it's filled with a number of articles that talk about key concepts in employment law, and really just are a lot of 101s. And and really the idea is that if someone can go there and read that and understand what's going on, and they don't necessarily have to pay for legal services, or it allows them to get perhaps a better grasp of what's going on, and then have a bit more discrete questions in terms of asking for legal services. That's really our goal. And so, given how much information is out there, if you do have any questions, we definitely direct folks to Open Porta, just to get a base 101 understanding. Um, you don't have to click hire us or anything like that. It's really just as part of our commitment to our community abroad to organize accessible legal information for everybody. Apart from that, um, you did mention the discussion paper uh, that kind of underlies the Pay Transparency Act. I think that's an interesting one. You can find it on the government's website. It just essentially talks about kind of the gender pay gap, and why the government is doing what it's doing. I think it's some pictures, some colors. It's pretty user friendly in terms of reading, and it's a pretty quick read. And so, for anyone interested in the legislation, I think that's a good place to start. The government webpage as well often has a lot of the information that we've talked about today, and in a pretty accessible way. And so, if I've put you to sleep, and you'd rather spend 30 seconds just reading what's up there, then I'd recommend that as well.
Fantastic. So, for anyone looking to find more information about the show, you can subscribe on YouTube, or you can go to the QR code there for other episodes or information about myself and the show. I'll try to link to the discussion paper and Open Porta in the show notes on YouTube. For anyone that's a Chat GPT believer, I uploaded it to Chat GPT and got a summary to prepare for this episode. It is pretty easy to understand what's going on with the legislation. Then once you get the general bits, you can ask folks like James and others more detailed questions and kind of dive deep into the information. And I'm now a firm believer that kind of like interpreting law and AI is so much better for us laymen's to kind of get up to the table to ask good questions to lawyers like yourself, James. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening into this episode. And if you like the show, please subscribe on YouTube, like the content. This is the last episode of 2023, so hopefully everyone enjoyed our discussion today about the Pay Transparency Act, and I'll be putting together some more content in the next few weeks, and you'll see me back in 2024. So I'd like to thank James for attending the show, and hope everyone has a great day.